Focus on art. A personal visit with the artists, museum curators, and gallery directors of northeastern Oklahoma. A presentation of the Rogers State College Art Department.
Welcome once again to Focus on Art. I'm your host, Barbara Cohen-Auer. This evening, Focus on Art is in Ardmore, Oklahoma, at the Charles B. Goddard Center for an exhibit by the Oklahoma Society of Impressionists. Gary Moeller is our guest this evening. Gary, welcome to Focus on Art.
Thank you, Barbara.
Gary has been a guest for Focus on Art before. He is chairman of the art department at Rogers State College, a very fine painter in his own right, and one of my best friends. Gary, it's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for inviting me again.
We want to do a couple of things this evening. We want to talk about the Oklahoma Society for Impressionist Painting, the kinds of things you do, what your purpose is, the people that are involved, and then we'd like to take a gallery tour with Gary, take a look at some of these paintings. They're absolutely gorgeous. It's going to be, gosh, a beautiful, colorful show. I can hardly wait to start walking around. But before we do that, let's talk about the idea of Impressionism first of all.
Well, Impressionism was born mainly from romantic realism, you might say, and also it had to do a lot with social movements. The ruling class of the 19th century French countryside had a lot to do with it. The idea of romanticism coming into the city and people looking at things in a very normal way as opposed to royalty or the church having the influence on the art. It was everybody's art, and that was the revolutionary concept behind it. It also had a lot to do with quick impressions of concepts in terms of things seen, light, movement, time, were all considerations.
Gary, when I think of French Impressionism, I think of a period of time about 1863 to perhaps the end of the 19th century, and I think of that style as covering that period of time. Now we're talking about artists working in the same style basically 100 years later. Is there a relationship between contemporary Impressionism and the older style of French Impressionism?
Yes, but in the real sense, I don't think styles ever really come to an end. They always influence people after them. Painters that come after them are influenced in some way by just knowing about and studying those particular painters, whether it be Impressionism or Surrealism. There's some influence on painters of any walks of life that, and later on, that pick up those particular veins of stylization. So, excuse me, the idea of Impressionist ending only means that that particular group of that time ceased to exist, but their work certainly didn't, and their influence certainly didn't. So it's a very lively time that continues on. It still is a major part of our environments. You'll see Impressionist painting everywhere you go, in museums and homes and so forth. It's one of the most attractive, decorative types of work that you will see, even though it didn't start out that way.
Does this style follow the same techniques as the earlier French Impressionists?
No, not at all. It's more influenced. I'm a brand new member of this group, but from the meetings and talks that I've had with the different members, it's more of an influential idea. A lot of plein air painting, going out and painting things on site, outside a lot. The attraction of the color and the movement and all that we spoke of really is what it's all about in that sense. It's beautiful. And most of the time it's very, very attractive and decorative, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Well now, Gary, if we wanted to give some visual clues to our viewers, things that they could look for in works of art that would be best described as Impressionist works, what would those be?
Light, number one. Of course, you have to have light to see anything, of course, but in terms of movement, very important. Active light, very dynamic movement of light, light falling over things, light and shadow. Monet, for instance, in the haystacks, he painted a series of haystacks at different times during the day to show the different coloration that light change and shadow would have on those haystacks. And that is very important to the concept of Impressionism.
Okay, and the broken use of color.
Yeah, many times that is a key too. You expect to see a lot of strokes that are very raw, that are unified from a distance. Up close they may look like very raw strokes of color, but at a distance it usually forms something or an impression of something.
Well, Gary, I appreciate the introduction, and I think it's time now to stop talking and start looking. Let's go for a little tour around the gallery.
All right, let's do that, Barbara. Well, we'll start over here with Diane MacDonald's work. Her work is classic Impressionism, I would say, in terms of the color, brushstroke direction. You notice that the brushstrokes often have a lot of movement to them, and they seem to have a lot of intentional directional movement to them to create a certain surface or light effect, and using a lot of primary color, reds, yellows, and blues, high contrast separations of those colors in terms of darks and lights. Really gives you a feeling of sunlight, and the shadows falling across the girl's hat and so forth really create that illusion as well.
Okay, well, this is certainly a beautiful painting, and the title of this painting is?
Summer Sun, which makes a lot of sense considering how warm the whole thing looks.
Now, do we have any other paintings in this exhibit by Diane?
Yeah, she has two others. One, a mountain scene with aspens, apparently, two small paintings, and then more of a desert environment. Looked like New Mexico terrain, possibly. And they're also relatively typical of the kind of subject matter that American Impressionists would like to deal with, and the modern Impressionists that we have here consider.
Okay, where would you like to go from Diane MacDonald?
Well, in the gallery, adjacent to Diane's work, is some work by Leonard Wren, a couple paintings, very active paintings, one a very small little rooster, which is one of my favorite pieces in the whole show, and then a larger piece of a kind of an oblique angle of three figures seated on the grass, which kind of beckons back to some work from Manet in some ways in terms of subject matter. But going back to the rooster, the reason I appreciate that piece so much is because of the dynamic nature of the color strokes, the way the paint's laid on the canvas, and the idea of action. The rooster really does look like it's strutting, which I believe is the title of that piece. And that's another advantage to Impressionism, is the fact that it almost has a futurist kind of look to it, and the fact that you can almost feel the next movement that's coming about in the painting. Then the larger piece of the three figures basically is a portrait painting of actual individuals that Leonard knows, and it's a very curious angle and a very curious look to the faces, and it's kind of a fun painting just to examine and try to figure out the story behind.
We might take a note up there in the upper left-hand corner of the painting, how very broad and very loose those brush strokes are, and how much tighter the brush strokes get and how much more control as we get down to the faces, the individuals.
You could almost relate that to depth of field in photography, in a sense, kind of a focal point, focal area, looser strokes as you go out of the focus, tighter strokes as you come into the focus. So there's a strong relationship, and it adds a lot to the depth of the painting, because in a real sense it's a very shallow painting in terms of depth. We're not looking at a great landscape here in terms of distance. So that adds to the depth of the painting, the fact that the strokes are looser or tighter in different areas. It's Wanda Brown from Owasso, Oklahoma. She has a number of pieces that incorporate vegetation, a lot of foliage, azaleas, and some still life objects associated with flowers. Very strong use of red and crimson colors in association with blues and greens. Very active paintings in terms of the coloration.
Gary, as I look at that particular painting, I certainly am reminded of Monet's water lilies. Certainly would think of that as, or the series of paintings by Monet as perhaps some source material for Wanda when she did this particular painting.
Well, I'm sure Wanda would be glad to hear that, because I know she appreciates Monet's work. And it's true, because he did deal a lot with the kind of dualistic understanding of what you see reflected, what's on the surface and what's in the water, in a sense. And she also, as I said, is working with those concepts.
As we continue on around the gallery, the next artist that we see is Claudia Doyle. Gary, you want to make some comments about Claudia's painting?
Probably the one that catches my eye the most, the oil painting. Now, Claudia works both in oil, watercolor, and other mediums. But as far as the painting that I find most interesting is the geraniums. The reason for that is because of her use of shadow and light on the surface next to the geraniums, the concrete or whatever, that shows you the use of positive and negative space. The fact that in most paintings, and especially in Impressionism, what's behind something or what's not necessarily the subject matter is just as important as the subject matter. So the light and shade is really the subject matter, the color is the subject matter, as opposed to the geraniums. That's why they're such seemingly mundane subjects that have all this activity, is because we're looking at the qualities of those pieces as opposed to, whether it's a horse or whether it's a flower or whether it's water. That's not really important. It's the color, the movement, and that kind of thing.
And almost every part of the painting then is filled with important information.
Exactly. There's no dead space.
No background. It seems to be a very inappropriate term to use as we look at these
Right.
paintings.
There is no background, right.
Yeah, I think we might take just a quick look at the watercolor, because it is unusual to find an artist who's so accomplished in both media.
Right, and a lot of these people are. They've spent a lot of time working in different areas, and so she's a good example of that.
Carla Perry is the next artist to exhibit. Gary, let's talk about Carla.
Well, Carla's from the Manford, Oklahoma area. She lives on Keystone Lake. She has a lot of good subject matter there, lots of light coming off the water and so forth. And as you will see in some of her paintings, that's well exhibited. The painting that has the sun in it, the Sunset Reverie, reminds us a lot of the early works of Monet, and I think references, like you said earlier, when we had conversations about Turner, it also looks a little like Turner's work. Was it The Burning of the Houses of Parliament that you were speaking of? Which I've always thought that those two paintings worked rather well together myself. And so I don't know if that's what she had in mind or not. It doesn't really matter. It's a very nice painting, but it certainly beckons back to that kind of color and movement, and adds a lot to that time concept, the time of day, the fleeting time. Also, another reference we can make, even though I'm going out on a limb here by making references to people, historical references to people, but just to help the viewer understand what we're looking at here, William Ley, who has a great exhibit of work in the Gilcrease Museum, could also be referenced in the painting of the cool water that Carla has painted here, in terms of the way he blocks strokes, and almost a cubist, you might say, stroke. I'm not sure Carla would appreciate that description, but in a sense, William Ley is a very broken painter in terms of his stroke, and I think you see some of that in her work that she uses to good advantage in her own way.
Bert Hands is the next artist that we have exhibiting, Gary. Let's talk about Bert. First of all, I can tell from here we have some different media that we haven't discussed so far.
Right. Bert's a Bethany, Oklahoma artist that works in several different media as well. The examples he has in this gallery are oil and pastel. What I like to see in work is a thread of a continuous thread of style, maybe, or relationship to the artist. And in his work, you can look at the work and see him, you might say, the way he does things, without reference to the particular media that are being used. In other words, you can almost look at the pastel and see oil paint, look at the oil paint and see pastel, because it's his use of color the way he lays it down that makes the difference, and not necessarily what he's using, because it seems to integrate so well one to the other. Matter of fact, he could mix the media without a problem at all and do well. I'm intrigued with mostly with the painting of the morning workout of the horse, which has this interesting backlit halo in the prancing horse. You know, subject matter, of course, you think of Degas and so forth, and his horse racing scenes. I'm not sure how much that looks like Degas' work, and not really, but there's obviously some references to subject matter. But most impressive is his use of very, very subtle pastel color and minimal subject orientation or detail.
One thing that I think is interesting about that painting, and reminds me also of Degas, is the halo around the horse becomes a beautiful calligraphic line.
Right.
And we don't find a great deal of beautiful line quality. Impressionist painting, line was not their primary concern, except with Degas.
Right.
And I think we see that. Maybe a reference once again here.
There are some linear references in Japanese prints that certainly influenced the Impressionists, and so maybe in that sense it works very well. Joan Marin, she's from Oklahoma City. She's a very well-known regional painter, quite accomplished in her use of color, and seems quite confident in what she does. Again, we have some relationships of color, for instance, the complementary colors of red and green that really spring to life certain paintings in her display. And the way she uses those reds and greens may also be something that we can learn from Impressionism, and the fact that most of the time a color is laid down in variations of values and intensities as opposed to just one color being laid down, and that's where you get that springing to life of color.